It's been 6 years since the end of the Spanish-American War, and it is now February 8, 1904. And war begins between Russia and Japan. This war is known as the Russo-Japanese War, or the Sino-Russian War. This war is fought in and over northern Manchuria and Korea. There's a port city in Manchuria, west of what is now North Korea, that the Russians wanted to maintain control of. This port was called Port Arthur at the time. Control over this port was one of the main causes of the war. The Russians wanted a warm water port that was in operation year-round. This was before climate change, and all the Russian Pacific ports used to freeze over in the wintertime. The only Pacific port available to the Russians was Vladivostok, and it was frozen half the year. A railroad was built through Manchuria by the Russians from 1896 up until 1904. That was also a real point of contention for the Japanese. Japan was worried about the Russians crowding in on their plans to create a sphere of influence in Korea and Manchuria, which is in China. Seeing Russia as a rival, ruled by this guy, Tsar Nicholas II, who was, by the way, first cousins with King George V of England and King Wilhelm II of Germany. I'll cover that in another video. Japan offered to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition by Russia that Korea was in the Japanese sphere of influence. Of course, Russia refused and demanded Korea north of the 39th parallel, and this is still with us today, to be a neutral buffer between Russia and Japan. After negotiations broke down in 1904, the Japanese Navy, led by this guy, Admiral Tojo, opened hostilities by attacking the Russian Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur, China, in a surprise attack. Japanese surprise naval attack? Who ever heard of that? Anyways, Russia suffered multiple defeats by Japan. Port Arthur was laid siege to by the Japanese Navy. The superior naval guns helped the ground forces defeat the Russian army at Port Arthur, but Tsar Nicholas II was convinced that Russia could win and chose to remain engaged in the war. He decided to wait out the outcomes of a future naval battle. The Tsar had sent his Asian Baltic fleet from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific all the way around the Horn of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, through the South China Sea, to just south and east of the Korean Peninsula. There, the Japanese fleet was waiting for him. The Baltic fleet was wiped out by the Japanese Navy near the Tsushima Islands. This was the first time that an Asian country had defeated a Western empire in war. This created quite a bit of nationalistic pride for both Japan and China. Lenin, Vladimir, not John, John's hair was much longer, then stated that this was the beginning of the end of Tsarist rule in Russia. Vladimir Lenin plays a very important role for Russia and Europe in the future, as you will see. On September 5th of 1905, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt helped work out a treaty between Russia and Japan after Russia's defeat both on land and sea. This is the Treaty of Portsmouth. It was negotiated in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and was signed on 5 September of 1905. Japan is awarded Korea and northern Manchuria, and the Russians agreed to pull out of Manchuria. This war is important and relevant to the 95 Years' War, because even though in the future Russians and the Japanese fight on the same side in what will be called the Great War, Japan's victory will worry the Russians when they are not fighting on the same side in what we call World War II. It's also important to note that this was the first war where there is the use of the Maxim machine gun. It was invented in 1886, but was not used during the Spanish-American War I talked about in my last video. Even though it was used, none of the Western militaries noted its devastating effect against troops in the open. And many men will die because of this lack of attention to detail in the continuation of the 95 Years' War. Due to this, there were somewhere between 130,000 to 170,000 dead people in the war between Russia and Japan. So let's add an even 150,000 to our body count. In my next video, I will talk about the royal families in Europe and Japan during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, like I mentioned earlier. I feel it is important to see a connection between them and how it ties together with the 95 Years' War. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button, click on the subscribe button, and then click on the notification bell so you will be notified when the next video comes out. Share this with a friend if you think they might be interested with it. Thank you so much for watching. This is World War II with Mike W., the history of the 95 Years' War. And we'll see you next week.